A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks on. But when a white cop spits in his face, thinking he's just a nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them all reeling. It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August when Derek Harris, a newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in the heart of Morningside, a small city tucked away in the rolling hills of Tennessee. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, he didn't look the part of a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. That was exactly his intention. Derek believed in seeing things for what they truly were, not through the polished lens of scheduled meetings or rehearsed welcomes. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a precinct plagued by whispers of misconduct, he wanted to observe the department unfiltered. What better way to do that than to blend in? The precinct's parking lot buzzed with officers coming and going. Derek scanned the area, noting the casual banter and the occasional glances his way. No one seemed to recognize him, which wasn't surprising. His appointment had only been announced a few days ago, and he had chosen not to publicize his arrival until the official inspection later that morning. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and took a deep breath. The weight of his mission to root out the toxicity festering within the department pressed heavily on his shoulders. He was no stranger to resistance, but he knew this job would test him in ways he hadn't imagined. As he approached the building, the faint sound of laughter carried through the air. Derek stepped through the side entrance unnoticed among the hum of casual chatter and ringing phones. The tiled floors glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. He walked slowly, observing the dynamics around him. Groups of officers huddled near desks, some swapping stories, others reviewing paperwork. No one paid him much attention until he paused near the break room. "Hey, you!" A sharp voice cut through the noise. Derek turned to see a white officer striding toward him with a smug grin plastered on his face. His badge read Officer Clark. Behind him, a few others leaned against the wall, watching with interest. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but Clark didn't give him the chance. "Lost, are we? This isn't a shelter," the officer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." Derek froze, the words landing like a punch. He wasn't sure whether to correct the man immediately or let the scene unfold further. Before he could decide, Clark stepped closer, his voice rising for the benefit of the onlookers. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the onlookers, and Derek clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He tried to speak, but Clark leaned in, his face inches away. Then, without warning, the officer spat straight into Derek's face. Time seemed to stop. Derek's breath hitched as the warm saliva dripped down his cheek. Around him, the laughter grew louder. One officer slapped the table, doubling over in amusement, while another muttered something about showing the riffraff their place. Derek's mind raced. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his composure. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his face. His movements were slow and deliberate. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Clark smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The group burst into laughter again, but Derek said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked down the hallway, leaving the officers behind as he headed toward the precinct's main office. An intercom crackled to life, calling all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The briefing room was abuzz with chatter as officers filed in, some carrying coffee mugs, others laughing over inside jokes. Derek entered through a side door, now holding a folder that bore the precinct's official seal. He stood just out of view, watching the room fill with familiar faces, some still chuckling from the earlier incident. At the front of the room, Captain Blake, a stout man with a graying mustache, called for order. "All right, settle down, everyone. We've got an important introduction today," Captain Blake said. The officers quieted, their curiosity piqued. Clark leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his smug expression still plastered on his face. He clearly enjoyed the morning's entertainment. "Most of you know," Captain Blake continued, "Chief Turner retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department." Derek Harris stepped forward, his footsteps steady and deliberate. The room felt suffocating, the tension thickening as he approached the podium. He placed the folder down on the lectern, slowly scanning the room. His calm demeanor only heightened the discomfort in the air. Officer Clark's smirk faltered, his confidence suddenly draining away as recognition slowly washed over him. The rest of the officers exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the room. Derek's voice broke the silence, cutting through the heaviness in the air. "Good morning," he began, his tone even, firm. "My name is Derek Harris. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." The silence was deafening. Officer Clark's face turned an alarming shade of red, his bravado evaporating in an instant. Derek's gaze landed on him, holding it just a little longer than necessary before sweeping across the rest of the room. "As I arrived this morning," Derek continued, "I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department without any filters. What I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur rippled through the officers, but Derek raised a hand, commanding silence. "My brief time here, I've already seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but downright unacceptable." Derek's voice grew more intense, though still under perfect control. "Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." The room stayed eerily quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Officer Clark shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. Derek took a deliberate step closer to the podium's edge, his voice rising in intensity, but maintaining its controlled edge. "Respect is not optional," Derek declared. "It's the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the community we are meant to serve." He let the silence sit, the officers squirming under his unflinching gaze. "This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place," Derek said, his voice cutting like a blade through the air. "But let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." His words landed like a heavy punch. The officers, once casual and amused, were now frozen. Not one of them dared to move, the room thick with tension. Derek let the silence linger, his eyes locking with each officer's, and the weight of his words hanging in the air. Clark shifted once more, sweat visibly beading on his forehead as he avoided eye contact. But Derek wasn't finished. "I understand that change is difficult," Derek continued, his voice steady but laced with authority. "But let me be clear, there will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, whether that person is a colleague, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped away from the podium, walking slowly toward the officers. His presence was commanding, yet there was a calm fury behind every step. The officers stood still, some nervously shifting, others with their eyes glued to the floor. "Officer Clark," Derek said, stopping just a few feet from the man. Clark flinched, his smug expression from earlier completely gone. "You," Derek said, his gaze piercing, "represent everything that's wrong with this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath we swore, and the community we vowed to protect." Clark stammered, barely able to get words out. "Chief, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Derek interrupted, his voice sharp. "You didn't care to know. You didn't take a moment to think before you acted because you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the people it serves." The room remained deathly silent. Every officer stood still, knowing they were witnessing a turning point. Derek turned his attention to the rest of the group. "What I witnessed wasn't just one man's mistake. Derek said, his voice rising slightly. It was a culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice are not only tolerated but celebrated. And that stops now. He walked back toward the podium, his steps firm. I've spent my career fighting for justice. Not just on the streets, but within the walls of departments like this one. Change isn't easy and it won't happen overnight. But I promise you this, as long as I'm chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability. Derek paused, allowing his words to sink in. He looked over at Captain Blake, nodding toward him, signaling the final decision. Effective immediately, Derek said, his tone resolute. Officer Clark is suspended pending an internal investigation, and for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is just the beginning. Gasps filled the room, and Officer Clark's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he avoided the stares of his peers. Derek, unfazed, stood tall. This isn't about punishment, Derek said firmly. It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to it, this isn't the place for you. He glanced around the room one last time, locking eyes with each officer. If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together. But know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way. The meeting ended with a heavy silence. Officers shuffled out of the room without their usual chatter. Derek remained at the podium for a moment, watching as Clark stormed out, his face a mix of embarrassment and anger. The other officers avoided eye contact, their expressions ranging from guilt to quiet contemplation. Back in his office, Derek Harris sat down at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was just the beginning. Years of entrenched attitudes wouldn't change overnight, and for some, they might never change at all. But he hadn't come to Morningside to make friends. He came to make a difference. The phone on his desk rang. It was Captain Blake. "Chief, I wanted to say you handled that better than most would have," Blake said, his voice tentative. "Thanks, Captain," Derek replied, but his voice remained steady. "But the real work starts now. I need a full review of Clark's history on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports, everything you've got." Blake hesitated before responding. "Got it, Chief." "And, Chief, I think you shook a few of them today, in a good way." Derek hung up, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction before diving into the mountain of paperwork in front of him. Over the next few weeks, the precinct was a different place. Officers who once laughed at Clark's antics now avoided him altogether, whispers of his suspension spreading through the department. Derek made it a point to walk the halls regularly, greeting everyone he passed. His presence was a constant reminder of his leadership. Some officers took the change to heart. Officer Matthews, a younger recruit, approached Derek one day, admitting that she'd been complicit in the toxic culture out of fear of retaliation. "I want to do better, Chief," she said earnestly. "That's all I ask," Derek replied, his voice kind but firm. "It starts with you." But not everyone was willing to change. Clark filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. Derek held his ground, standing firm in his belief that accountability wasn't optional. The department's review uncovered a string of previous complaints against Clark, ranging from excessive force to inappropriate comments. His appeal was denied, and Derek made it clear that the days of brushing misconduct under the rug were over. Despite the progress, Derek knew the road ahead would be long. Conversations about implicit bias and community relations were met with mixed reactions, but he remained undeterred. Each small victory, a recruit speaking up, an officer rethinking their approach, was a step towards something greater. One morning, Derek attended a community event where he met a young boy who shyly approached him. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I am," Derek said with a smile. "My dad says the police don't care about us," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek crouched down to meet his gaze. "I can't change the past, but I promise we're working to do better," he said gently. and if you ever need help, you come find me, okay?" The boy nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. It was moments like this that reminded Derek why he had taken the job in the first place. By the end of his first year, the precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. Officers who couldn't adapt were gone, replaced by recruits who shared Derek's vision for a fair and respectful department. The community, once skeptical, began to see signs of change, a renewed effort to build trust and bridge divides. Derek stood in the precinct's main hallway one evening, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie felt different now, not at someone's expense, but genuine and inclusive. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but for the first time he felt hopeful. Change was never easy, but it was worth every fight.